Good evening, everybody. Welcome. Welcome. So if anybody who doesn't know me, I'm Reverend Alana. Hello. And Archdeacon Sally and I are going to be leading this Bible study slash Advent study slash book study on most especially the theme of Christmas Carol, and on a book called The Redemption of Scrooge by Matt Rawle. Has anybody here read The Redemption of Scrooge?
Part of it.
Part of it. Okay. And has anybody here read A Christmas Carol? And has anybody seen a movie version of A Christmas Carol? Yeah. Lots of people, right? And that's okay. It doesn't matter whether you've read all the things or none of the things, whether you've seen adaptations. I think everybody's seen an adaptation. So I think that helps us at least a little bit. So for our first week, what I'm going to do is I described in our email and when I announced it in church is I'm going to talk a little bit about the story. So for any of you who haven't read it, I'll be summarizing it and also reading some passages from it. So you get to hear what it sounds like for those of you who haven't read it. And then I will also be talking about the historical context of the story. So this was a story that was published in 1843. And so, there's a lot of things going on socially and politically, and they really influenced what Dickens was trying to do. How many people, one more thing, how many people have read something by Charles Dickens? Anything? Or seen a movie or television adaptation of something? Yeah. So, Charles Dickens was wildly popular author in the Victorian period. And everybody had probably read or heard one of his stories. And the thing is, that's amazing is, he's been dead for, over 100 years, and we've all read or seen something by Charles Dickens, right? So he's still incredibly popular and incredibly well known. It's like a cultural thing that we've absorbed, right? People use the word Dickensian, right, to describe something that's very quite appalling socially, or austere, or difficult, or even something that's very sort of cheery and Christmassy, like we see in A Christmas Carol, right? So we're going to start with week one, The Ghost of an Idea. So when A Christmas Carol was published in December of 1843, Dickens had an author's note in which he said this: "I have endeavored in this ghostly little book to raise the ghost of an idea, which shall not put my readers out of humor with themselves, with each other, with the season, or with me. May it haunt their houses pleasantly, and no one wish to lay it. Their faithful friend and servant, C.D., December 1843. From which we get this week's title. So, Charles Dickens. This is the image we think of, right? With the beard. If we've seen a photo, this is a very nice posed photo of Dickens writing at his desk, the great man creating, right? In December of 1843, Dickens was 31 years old, and he was a popular and established author. His family was middle class, and his childhood had been an easy one until he was 12, which was when his father, who was deeply in debt, was forced into what was called debtor's prison. Debtor's prison does what it says on the tin. So it's a prison for people who are in debt, and they work off their debt while they're in prison. And at the same time, Dickens' mother and younger siblings went to stay in the prison at the same time. And he, who was 12, was forced to give up school and give up and sell and pawn many of his belongings, especially his beloved book collection. And he went to work in a boot blacking factory. So that's a shoe polish factory. His job was to attach labels to the bottles of boot black. And the conditions were terrible in this factory. And he had a lot of difficulty with it because, like I said, he was middle class in background, and these people were working class. And even though he wanted to get to know them and sympathize with them deeply, he didn't quite fit in, right? Because he wasn't from the same places as they were. And the conditions in the factory were terrible. And he told a friend many years later, he described it. The Blacking Warehouse was the last house on the left-hand side of the way at Old Hungerford Stairs. It was a crazy, tumble-down old house, abutting, of course, on the river and literally overrun with rats. Its wainscoted rooms and its rotten floors and staircase and the old gray rats swarming down in the cellars and the sound of their squeaking and scuffling coming up the stairs at all times. And the dirt and decay of the place rise up visibly before me as if I were there again. The counting house was on the first floor, looking over the coal barges and the river. There was a recess in it in which I was to sit and work. This is someone decades later who's talking. Sorry if anybody's afraid of rats. But you can see he's almost triggered by the memory, right? This is a deep and abiding memory, and he never, ever forgot it. This is an artist's interpretation of young Dickens at the bootblacking factory. You can see that's that pot there with the brush in it. That's the glue to stick the label to the bottle of boot black. Right? Dickens would never forget it. He would never forget what he saw during his time when his father was in the debtor's prison. And all of his experiences and observations, both at this time and afterwards, they really helped him to fill his later writings with the people and places that he had encountered in those years. In 1833, when Dickens was 21, he published his first story in a magazine. And he also worked at this time as a political journalist. His rise in popularity was rapid, partially because he was desperate to become popular and to become financially solvent. Because again, this was a fear that he also never got over, was this idea of being in debt like his father. In 1836, he married his wife, Catherine, and they started a family. And just a year before A Christmas Carol was published, they toured the United States and Canada. And as 1842 came to a close, Dickens was a well-established author with 6 major works to his name, and a new work, Martin Chuzzlewit, was premiering on December 31st. One thing that was very famous about Dickens' works is they were produced as a serial. So you would get certain sections. If you read a Dickens novel now, a lot of the time they'll say end of part 1 or part 2, and those were the sections that people would read. And there's a very famous story in one of his stories. There's a character called Little Nell, and it's possibly true and it's possibly not that a ship was coming in bearing the next section of the story, and people were on the docks shouting to the people on the ship, "Is Little Nell dead?" There was a cliffhanger, and we think it's bad when the TV show we watch breaks for the summer and we had a cliffhanger, right? But this was people waiting literally in other countries for the next installment to come in. So the first installment of Martin Chuzzlewit was published on the 31st of December, 1842. Dickens, this is Dickens in 1842 when he was 30. No beard, a little bit different, right? As 1843 progressed, however, Dickens began to worry. He was financially supporting his parents because his father, John, was utterly unreliable when it came to money still. And later in the year, Catherine Dickens became pregnant with her 5th child. Finally, Martin Chuzzlewit was not selling as well as some of Dickens' previous works. So Dickens was worried about money. But at the same time, he had toured Cornish tin mines, which employed children as well as adults. And in London, he had toured what's called a ragged school. That is a school that's set up for poor children. And he was so appalled by the condition, both in the tin mines and in the ragged school, that he wanted to do something about it. And he was certainly remembering that rotten, rat-infested bootblack factory, right? So he came up with a solution to both his problems. He would write a short Christmas story, no installments, just 1 volume, right? And it would quickly make him money. And best of all, it would draw attention to the plight of the urban poor in a way that he thought would be more effective than if he wrote a pamphlet or gave a speech, right? Sometimes something fictional reaches people better than something real. Now, here's the thing about the urban poor. At this point of time, there was a combination of mass employment, bad harvests, industrial technology replacing agricultural workers, and a mass exodus into urban centers like London or Manchester, say Birmingham. So these are people that they don't have any work in the countryside because of the Industrial Revolution, and they're fleeing to the urban centers for work, and there aren't enough jobs. So in 1834, there was a thing that was established called the Poor Law. And one of the consequences of that law was that the only way to receive relief was to enter a workhouse. A person or a family was offered the house, as the expression went, and nothing else. So it was the workhouse or it was death for many people. The workhouse is a building or a series of buildings which was designed to feed, house, and employ people who were unable to support themselves. This is a workhouse. As you can see on the screen, everyone at home. You can see on the wall, there's the slogan, God is good, and on the other, God is just, which is kind of an interesting thing to have on the wall in the situation that you're in a workhouse. The problem was that by the time that A Christmas Carol takes place, many such institutions were badly managed. One description from a few decades before said this: the workhouse is an inconvenient building with small windows, low rooms, and dark staircases. It is surrounded by a high wall that gives it the appearance of a prison and prevents free circulation of air. There are 8 or 10 beds in each room, retentive of all sense and very productive of vermin. The passages are in great want of whitewashing. No regular account is kept of births and deaths, but when smallpox, measles, or malignant fevers make their appearance in the house, the mortality is very great. Of 131 inmates in the house, 60 are children. People were segregating according to their gender and their age. So children under the age of 2 could remain with their mothers, everybody else according to gender or age. There's a story that, so Charlie Chaplin, the comedian, you know, the little tramp, right? He spent some time in a workhouse when he was a very young child. So this would have been the 1890s. His mother struggled with alcoholism and mental illness. And she and Charlie and his brother Sidney were in a workhouse, but of course they were separated from each other. Now the only difference, real difference, the food was slightly better. It was at least apparently nutritionally adequate. Wasn't good, it was just enough, I guess. And the other thing about a workhouse is you could leave whenever you wanted. And so their mother, Hannah was her name, Hannah Chaplin, she checked them all out of the workhouse and they spent the day out. They went for ice cream, they walked around London, they had a wonderful time, and at the end of the day, she took them all back to the workhouse. There's a social historian named Simon Fowler who had this to say about workhouses. He's a modern historian. He said, they were largely designed for a pool of able-bodied idlers and shirkers. However, this group hardly existed outside the imagination of a generation of political economists. Both then, as there is now, some people assume that if you're poor, it's your own fault, right? If you just pulled yourself up by your bootstraps, right? If you just did the right thing, you must have done the wrong thing. You stopped eating avocado toast. If you stopped, you know, doing all these little things, you wouldn't be poor anymore, and we shouldn't have to support you, right? Some things don't change very much, a little bit. In 1997, they did a survey, and it was estimated that of the then current British population, this is in 1997, 10% of them had a genealogical connection to a workhouse. In other words, 10% of the population, some ancestor or ancestors had been in the workhouse. That's huge. It's enormous. The last workhouse was not closed until 1948. With the passing of the National Assistance Act, which was put forth by the Labour government after the Second World War. That was the beginning of the National Health Service, their socialized medicine, a lot of the social assistance programs, and that's why they no longer needed what was left of the workhouse system at the time. Workhouse, and sometimes in parts of Scotland and Ireland, it's called the poorhouse. Same thing, okay?
More honest.
More honest, yes, yeah. Briefly put, There were social assistance systems in place in 1843, but they were harsh, uncompromising, and insufficient to help, particularly if the victims of poverty and privation were children. And there was little help for those who were just scraping by, like the Cratchits in A Christmas Carol. All of these things were in place, and they were perfectly legal. Right? But what responsibility did people have towards their fellow human beings? Right? This was a question which Charles Dickens would ask over and over again in all of his works. So, the story. This is a picture, you can see the white gloves. This is a first edition, very rare, of A Christmas Carol, the opening page. You see the title page on one side and a color illustration on the other. Dickens insisted particularly on there being color illustrations in this book. And many of the pictures you're about to see as I tell the story are from that original edition. So, most adaptations of A Christmas Carol start with meeting the character of Ebenezer Scrooge. But the actual story starts this way. Marley was dead to begin with. There was no doubt whatever about that. The register of his burial was signed by the clergyman, the clerk, the undertaker, and the chief mourner. Scrooge signed it, and Scrooge's name was good upon change for anything he put his hand to. Old Marley was dead as a doornail. Mind, I don't need to say that I know of my own knowledge what there is particularly dead about a doornail. I might have been inclined myself to regard a coffin nail as the deadest piece of ironmongery in the trade, but the wisdom of our ancestors is in the simile, and my unhallowed hands shall not disturb it, or the country is done for. You will therefore permit me to repeat emphatically that Marley was dead as a doornail. Scrooge knew he was dead? Of course he did. How could it be otherwise? Scrooge and he were partners for I don't know how many years. Scrooge was his sole executor, his sole administrator, his sole assign, his sole residuary legatee, his sole friend, and sole mourner. Even Scrooge was not so dreadfully cut up by the sad event, but that he was an excellent man of business on the very day of the funeral and solemnized it with an undoubted bargain. Mention of Marley's funeral brings me back to the point I started from. There is no doubt that Marley was dead. This must be distinctly understood, or nothing wonderful can come of the story I'm about to relate. And then Dickens introduces the character of Scrooge on Christmas Eve, 7 years after the death of his partner Marley, like this. Scrooge never painted out old Marley's name. There it stood years afterwards above the warehouse door, Scrooge and Marley. The firm was known as Scrooge and Marley. Sometimes people new to the business called Scrooge Scrooge, and sometimes Marley. But he answered to both names. It was all the same to him. Oh, but he was a tight-fisted, hand at the grindstone Scrooge, a squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner, hard and sharp as flint, from which no steel had ever struck out generous fire, secret and self-contained and solitary as an oyster. The cold within him froze his old features, nipped his pointed nose, shriveled his cheek, stiffened his gait, made his eyes red, his thin lips blue, and spoke out shrewdly in his grating voice. A frosty rime was on his head and on his eyebrows and his wiry chin. He carried his own low temperature always about with him. He iced his office in the dog days and didn't thaw it 1 degree at Christmas. If we were in a university English class, we would be analyzing all the images of frigidity in that passage. In a few sentences, Dickens manages to convey what kind of man Scrooge is. He's cold and he's solitary. Even in his place of business, it's unheated, and his clerk, Bob Cratchit, tries to warm his hands at his own candle, unsuccessfully, I might add. At this moment, Scrooge's nephew, Fred, the only child of his sister, Fan, comes bursting into the room, wishing everybody a Merry Christmas, which goes over with Scrooge like a lead balloon. Fred has this to say about Christmas. There are many things from which I might have derived good, by which I have not profited, I dare say. returned the nephew. Christmas among the rest. But I am sure I have always thought of Christmas time when it has come round, apart from the veneration due to its sacred name and origin, if anything belonging to it can be apart from that, as a good time, a kind, forgiving, charitable, pleasant time, the only time I know of in the long calendar of the year when men and women seem by one consent to open their shut-up hearts freely and to think of people below them as if they were really fellow passengers to the grave and not another race of creatures bound on other journeys. And therefore, uncle, though it has never put a scrap of gold or silver in my pocket, I believe that it has done me good and will do me good, and I say, God bless it. The next people to enter Scrooge's place of business are two gentlemen who are looking for donations from businesses on behalf of the poor, rather like people do in our own time, right? Lots of messages in your inbox or telephone calls asking for donations this time of year. Their request goes about as well as Fred's cheery Merry Christmas greetings. At this festive season of the year, Mr. Scrooge, said the gentleman, taking up a pen, it is more than usually desirable that we should make some slight provision for the poor and destitute who suffer greatly at the present time. Many thousands are in want of common necessities. Hundreds of thousands are in want of common comforts, sir. Are there no prisons? Asked Scrooge. Plenty of prisons, said the gentleman, laying down the pen again. And the union workhouses, demanded Scrooge, are they still in operation? They are, still, returned the gentleman. I wish I could say they were not. The treadmill and the poor law are in full vigor then, said Scrooge. Both very busy, sir. Oh, I was afraid from what you said at first that something had occurred to stop them in their useful course, said Scrooge. I'm very glad to hear it. Under the impression that they scarcely furnish Christian cheer of mind or body to the multitude, returned the gentleman, a few of us are endeavoring to raise a fund to buy the poor some meat and drink and means of warmth. We choose this time because it is a time of all others when want is keenly felt and abundance rejoices. What shall I put you down for? Nothing, Scrooge replied. You wish to be anonymous? I wish to be left alone, said Scrooge. Since you ask me what I wish, gentlemen, this is my answer. I don't make merry myself at Christmas, and I can't afford to make idle people merry. I help to support the establishments I have mentioned. They cost enough, and those who are badly off must go there. Many can't go there, and many would rather die. If they would rather die, said Scrooge, they had better do it and decrease the surplus population. Of course, the sentiments which Scrooge is expressing are perfectly legal, as I said. The workhouses, the treadmill, the poor law. These are all things that were created, right, to deal with a large number of people in need. Everything Scrooge mentions is perfectly legal and logical. Moral, however. After grudgingly allowing Bob Cratchit to have the following day off, which is Christmas Day, Scrooge heads home, ignoring the other people on the way, including a young carol singer at his door. And he returns to the house that had once belonged to his partner, Marley. And then, to his great surprise, the ghost of Jacob Marley appears to him, wrapped in a huge chain weighed down with cash boxes, keys, padlocks, ledgers, deeds, and heavy purses wrought in steel. Scrooge asks about the chain. You are fettered, said Scrooge, trembling. Tell me why. I wear the chain I forged in life, replied the ghost. I made it, link by link and yard by yard. I girded it on of my own free will, and of my own free will I wore it. Is its pattern strange to you? Scrooge trembled more and more. Or would you know, pursued the ghost, the weight and length of the strong coil you bear yourself? It was full as heavy and as long as this 7 Christmas Eves ago. You have labored upon it since. It is a ponderous chain. The ghost of Jacob Marley tells Scrooge why he has appeared to him. You will be haunted, resumed the ghost, by 3 spirits. Scrooge's countenance fell almost as low as the ghost had done. Is that the chance and hope you have mentioned, Jacob? He demanded in a faltering voice. It is. I think I'd rather not, said Scrooge. Without their visits, said the ghost, you cannot hope to shun the path I tread. Expect the first tomorrow when the bell tolls 1. And Marley tells Scrooge to look out his own window into the street where he can see the ghost of many other people like Marley himself, who ignored their fellow human beings when they were alive and are unable to help them now that they are dead. The first spirit to appear to Scrooge is the ghost of Christmas past, which Dickens describes like this. It was a strange figure, like a child, yet not so like a child as like an old man, viewed through some supernatural medium, which gave it the appearance of having receded from view and being diminished to a child's proportions. Its hair, which hung about its neck and down its back, was white as if with age, and yet the face had not a wrinkle in it, and the tenderest bloom was on the skin. The arms were very long and muscular, the hands the same, as if its hold were of uncommon strength. Its legs and feet, most delicately formed, were, like those upper members, bare. It wore a tunic of the purest white, and round its waist was bound a lustrous belt, the sheen of which was beautiful. It held a branch of fresh green holly in its hand, and in singular contradiction of that wintry emblem, had its dress trimmed with summer flowers. But the strangest thing about it was that from the crown of its head there sprung a bright, clear jet of light, by which all this was visible, and which was doubtless the occasion of its using, in its duller moments, a great extinguisher for a cap, which it now held under its arm. Kind of hard to picture, right? That's the one we have the hardest time picturing, so much so that the original illustrator, the illustration you can see on your screen, that is the ghost underneath the extinguisher cap that he has, because the illustrator had no idea how to attempt it. So Scrooge says to the ghost of Christmas past, "Are you the spirit, sir, whose coming was foretold to me?" asked Scrooge. "I am." The voice was soft and gentle, singularly low, as if instead of being so close beside him, it were at a distance. "Who and what are you?" Scrooge demanded. "I am the ghost of Christmas past." "Long past?" inquired Scrooge, observant of its dwarfish stature. "No, your past." The ghost of Christmas past takes Scrooge back to his solitary boyhood at a boarding school, isolated from his family, and particularly his beloved younger sister, Fan. Seeing himself as a boy stirs something in Scrooge. "I wish," Scrooge muttered, putting his hand in his pocket and looking about him after drying his eyes with his cuff, "but it's too late now." "What is the matter?" asked the spirit. "Nothing," said Scrooge, "nothing. There was a boy singing a Christmas carol at my door last night. I should have liked to have given him something. That's all." It's the first thawing of Ebenezer Scrooge that we see in the story. Next, the ghost of Christmas past takes them to a time when Scrooge was an apprentice to the boisterous and generous Mr. Fezziwig, the illustration from the front cover. Fezziwig bears no expense to throw a ball for his employees and his friends in honor of Christmas. Lastly, the ghost of Christmas past brings Scrooge to the point in his life when he had been engaged to be married. He was not alone, but sat by the side of a fair young girl in a mourning dress, in whose eyes there were tears which sparkled in the light that shone out of the ghost of Christmas past. "It matters little," she said softly, "to you very little. Another idol has displaced me, and if it can cheer and comfort you in time to come, as I have tried to do, I have no just cause to grieve." "What idol has displaced you?" he rejoined. "A golden one." "This is the even-handed dealing of the world," he said. "There is nothing on which it is so hard as poverty, and there is nothing it professes to condemn with such severity as the pursuit of wealth." "You fear the world too much," she answered gently. "All your other hopes have merged into the hope of being beyond the chance of its sordid reproach. I have seen your nobler aspirations fall off one by one until the master passion gain engrosses you. Have I not?" "What then?" he retorted. "Even if I have grown so much wiser, what then? I am not changed towards you." She shook her head. "Am I?" "Our contract is an old one. It was made when we were both poor and content to be so, until in good season we could improve our worldly fortune by our patient industry. You are changed. When it was made, you were another man. I was a boy," he said impatiently. "Your own feeling tells you that you are not what you are." She returned. "I am. That which was promised happiness when we were one heart is fraught with misery now that we are two. How often and how keenly I have thought of this, I will not say. It is enough that I have thought of it and can release you. Belle, that's her name, Belle breaks off her engagement to Scrooge and eventually marries another and has a large family with him. And Scrooge is left to decide whether the money that he chose to value has the ability to support and comfort him instead of the life he might have had with her. Instead of appearing in Scrooge's bedroom, the next spirit waits for him in the living room until Scrooge has the courage to look in the door. And what Scrooge sees is this. The walls and ceiling were so hung with living green that it looked a perfect grove, from every part of which bright gleaming berries glistened. The crisp leaves of holly, mistletoe, and ivy reflected back the light, as if so many little mirrors had been scattered there. And such a mighty blaze went roaring up the chimney that, as that dull petrification of a hearth had never known in Scrooge's time or Marley's, or for many a winter season gone. Heaped up upon the floor to form a kind of throne were turkeys, geese, game, poultry, brawn, great joints of meat, sucking pigs, long wreaths of sausages, mince pies, plum puddings, barrels of oysters, red hot chestnuts, cherry-cheeked apples, juicy oranges, luscious pears, immense 12th cakes, and seething bowls of punch that made the chamber dim with their delicious steam. Anybody hungry yet? In easy state upon this couch there sat a jolly giant, glorious to see, who bore a glowing torch in shape not unlike Plenty's horn, and held it up high up to shed its light on Scrooge as he came peeping round the door. "Come in," exclaimed the ghost. "Come in and know me better, man." Scrooge entered timidly and hung his head before the spirit. He was not the dogged Scrooge he had been, and though his eyes were clear and kind, he did not like to meet them. "I am the ghost of Christmas present," said the spirit. "Look upon me." Scrooge reverently did so. It was clothed in one simple deep green robe or mantle bordered with white fur. This garment hung so loosely on the figure that its capacious breast was bare, as if disdaining to be warded or concealed by any artifice. Its feet, observable beneath the ample folds of the garment, were also bare, and on its head it wore no other covering than a holly wreath, set here and there with shining icicles. Its dark brown curls were long and free, free as its genial face, its sparkling eye, its open hand, its cheery voice, its unconstrained demeanor, and its joyful air. Girded round its middle was an antique scabbard, but no sword was in it, and the ancient sheath was eaten up with rust. Well, a spirit of love and peace doesn't need a sword, does it? The Ghost of Christmas Present shows Scrooge all kinds of Christmas celebrations in London and throughout the country. At one point, Scrooge asks about something which is confusing him. Many poor houses would not have had an oven. It's a bit like having a hot plate in your dorm. So if anyone wanted to cook something larger, then they would have it done in a shop. This is like a goose or a turkey, or they might buy it ready cooked, as sometimes we do now, chicken at the supermarket, right? For those people who need to purchase food or have it cooked outside their homes, the fact that the shops were open every day of the year was important. But there were some who claimed that these shops should be closed on Sundays, on a day of rest. Excuse me. But this would deprive many people of the only decent, relaxed family meal they might have in a week. Dickens was very much against this, and so he put this passage into the story. "Spirit," said Scrooge, after a moment's thought, "I wonder you, of all the beings in the many worlds about us, should desire to cramp these people's opportunities of innocent enjoyment, to have this food on any day of the week." "I," cried the spirit. "You would deprive them of their means of dining every seventh day, often the only day on which they can be said to dine at all," said Scrooge, "wouldn't you?" "I," cried the spirit. "You seek to close these places on the seventh day," said Scrooge, "and it comes to the same thing." "I seek," said the spirit. "Forgive me if I am wrong. It has been done in your name, or at least in that of your family." "There are some upon this earth of yours," returned the spirit, "who lay claim to know us, and who do their deeds of passion, pride, ill will, hatred, envy, bigotry, and selfishness in our name, who are as strange to us and all our kith and kin as if they had never lived. Remember that and charge their doings on themselves, not us. The Ghost of Christmas Present brings Scrooge to the home of Bob Cratchit, his clerk. And Scrooge, who has never bothered to learn anything about Bob's family life, is confronted by the Cratchits' poverty. Remember I said they're the kind of family that are scraping by. They're not in the workhouse yet. What he also learns about is the illness of their son, Tiny Tim. Bob and Tiny Tim have just returned from church, and while the other children are helping get their brother ready for the meal, Mr. and Mrs. Cratchit speak together. How did Tim behave? Asked Mrs. Cratchit. As good as gold, said Bob, and better. Somehow he gets thoughtful sitting by himself so much and thinks the strangest things you ever heard. He told me coming home that he hoped the people saw him in church because he was a cripple, and it might be pleasant to them to remember upon Christmas Day who made lame beggars walk and blind men see. Bob's voice was tremulous when he told them this, and trembled more when he said that Tiny Tim was growing strong and healthy. In spite of their modest Christmas meal, Scrooge can see that the Cratchits are an enthusiastic and loving family. But Scrooge has a question for the Ghost of Christmas Present. Bob proposed, "A Merry Christmas to us all, my dears, God bless us," which all the family re-echoed. "God bless us, everyone," said Tiny Tim, the last of all. He sat very close to his father's side upon his little stool. Bob held his withered little hand in his as if he loved the child and wished to keep him by his side and dreaded that he might be taken from him. "Spirit," said Scrooge, with an interest he had never felt before, "tell me if Tiny Tim will live." "I see a vacant seat," replied the ghost, "in the poor chimney corner and a crutch without an owner, carefully preserved. If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, the child will die." "No, no," said Scrooge. "Oh, no, kind spirit, say he will be spared." "If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, none other of my race," returned the ghost, "will find him here." "What then?" "If he be like to die, he had better do it and decrease the surplus population." Scrooge hung his head to hear his own words quoted by the spirit and was overcome with penitence and grief. "Man," said the ghost, "if man you be in heart, not adamant, forbear that wicked cant until you've discovered what surplus is and where it is. Will you decide what men shall live, what men shall die? It may be that in the sight of heaven you are more worthless and less fit to live than millions like this poor man's child. O God, to hear the insect on the leaf pronouncing on the too much life among his hungry brothers in the dust." The Ghost of Christmas Present shows Scrooge the home of his nephew, Fred, and the fun and feasting which happens there. Fred invited Scrooge to come to Christmas dinner, and Scrooge, of course, refused. But now he's beginning to see what he misses. And when someone at the party asks Fred why he is so sympathetic towards his uncle who never had a kind word for him, Fred replies, "I am sorry for him. I couldn't be angry with him if I tried. Who suffers by his ill whims? Himself, always." As this time with the Ghost of Christmas Present draws to a close, Scrooge thinks he sees something underneath the hem of the spirit's robe, and so the ghost shows him what it is. From the foldings of its robe, it brought two children, wretched, abject, frightful, hideous, miserable. They knelt down at its feet and clung upon the outside of its garment. "Oh man, look here, look down here," exclaimed the ghost. They were a boy and girl, yellow, meager, ragged, scowling, wolfish, but prostrate too in their humility. Where graceful youth should have filled their features out and touched them with its freshest tints, a stale and shriveled hand like that of age had pinched and twisted them and pulled them into shreds. Where angels might have sat enthroned, devils lurked and glared out menacing. No change, no degradation, no perversion of humanity in any grade through all the mysteries of wonderful creation has monsters half so horrible and dread. Scrooge started back, appalled. Having them shown to him in this way, he tried to say that they were fine children, but the words choked themselves rather than be parties to a lie of such enormous magnitude. Spirit, are they yours? Scrooge could say no more. They are man's, said the spirit, looking down upon them, and they cling to me, appealing from their fathers. This boy is ignorance. This girl is want. Beware them both in all of their degree, but most of all, beware this boy. For on his brow I see that written which is doom unless the writing be erased. Deny it, cried the spirit, stretching out its hand towards the city. Slander those who tell it you, omit it for your factious purposes, and make it worse, and bide the end. Have they no refuge or resource, cried Scrooge. Are there no prisons, said the spirit, turning on him for the last time with his own words. Are there no workhouses? The bell struck 12, and the spirit and the two children disappear. And Scrooge sees the last spirit, draped and hooded, coming like a mist along the ground towards him. The phantom slowly, gravely, silently approached. When it came near him, Scrooge bent down upon his knee, for in the very air through which this spirit moved, it seemed to scatter gloom and mystery. It was shrouded in a deep black garment which concealed its head, its face, its form, and left nothing of it visible save one outstretched hand. But for this, it would have been difficult to detach its figure from the night and separate it from the darkness by which it was surrounded. He felt that it was tall and stately when it came beside him, and that its mysterious presence filled him with a solemn dread. He knew no more, for the spirit neither spoke nor moved. I am in the presence of the ghost of Christmas yet to come, said Scrooge. The spirit answered not, but pointed downwards with its hand. You are about to show me shadows of the things that have not happened, but will happen in the time before us, Scrooge pursued. Is that so, spirit? The upper portion of the garment was contracted for an instant in its folds, as if the spirit had inclined its head. That was the only answer he received. The ghost of Christmas yet to come shows Scrooge the future, a future in which Tiny Tim has died. And all the people in the neighborhood are treating the death of a certain man with emotions ranging from relief to indifference. Scrooge is afraid to find out who the dead man is, but the ghost of Christmas yet to come forces him to realize that the dead man is himself, unmourned and as doomed as Jacob Marley had been. Standing over his own grave, Scrooge is terrified and repentant. He begs the spirit, hear me. I am not the man I was. I will not be the man I must have been but for this intercourse. Why show me this if I am past all hope? For the first time, the hand appeared to shake. Good spirit, he pursued, as down upon the ground he fell before it. Your nature intercedes for me and pities me. Assure me that I may yet challenge these shadows you have shown me by an altered life. The kind hand trembled. I will honor Christmas in my heart and try to keep it all the year. I will live in the past, the present, and the future. The spirits of all three shall strive within me. I will not shut out the lessons that they teach. Oh, tell me I may sponge away the writing on this stone. In his agony, he caught the spectral hand. It sought to free itself, but he was strong in his entreaty and detained it. The spirit, stronger yet, repulsed him. Holding up his hands in one last prayer to have his fate reversed, he saw an alteration in the phantom's hood and dress. It shrunk, collapsed, and dwindled down into a bedpost. Scrooge wakes up, and it is Christmas morning, and he realizes that he has the rest of his life ahead of him to do as much good in the world that he can. He orders an enormous turkey and pays to have it delivered to the Cratchits. He throws on his clothes and he shaves. He nearly slits his own throat because his hands are shaking so much in his excitement. He goes outside and he greets people warmly. I'm sure people were having a heck of a shock. He runs into one of the two gentlemen from the night before, the ones who were looking for a charitable donation. and he whispers the amount he now wishes to contribute into the gentleman's ear. Not a farthing less, he says. A great many back payments are included in it, I assure you. And when the gentleman tries to thank him, he insists that he doesn't need to be thanked, but will the gentleman come and see him? And the gentleman promises to do so. Scrooge goes to church, as one should on Christmas morning, and he walks through the streets afterwards, greeting people and patting children on the head and looking into people's windows. He's interested in the world in a way he never was before. And then he turns up at his nephew's house in the afternoon. Well, Fred and his wife are shocked to see him, but they welcome Scrooge with open arms. And Scrooge joins in that fun and feasting that he only got a glimpse of when the ghost showed it to him. And the next morning, Scrooge is sure to be in his office early and is delighted when Bob Cratchit comes in a little bit late to work. Scrooge pretends to be very angry with Bob, almost like he's going to fire him, only to suddenly insist that he will be raising his clerk's salary. So you can imagine that Bob Cratchit is a little bit alarmed. And as Dickens puts it, he has a momentary idea of knocking Scrooge down with a poker and holding him and calling to the people in the court for help in a straight waistcoat. He wants to call to have the little men in white take Scrooge away. But Scrooge manages to convince him that he is quite serious and mostly hasn't taken leave of the senses. Scrooge tells Bob that he wants to sit down with him with a bowl of Christmas punch. It's a type of punch called Smoking Bishop, which is a kind of mulled wine with citrus in it and lots of sugar and spices. That's the photograph here. And he wants to discuss with Bob Cratchit all the ways that Scrooge can help the Cratchit family, especially Tiny Tim. And so Scrooge has changed, and Dickens ends the story like this. Scrooge was better than his word. He did it all and infinitely more. And to Tiny Tim, who did not die, he was a second father. He became as good a friend, as good a master, and as good a man as the good old city knew, or any other good old city, town, and borough in the good old world. Some people laughed to see the alteration in him, but he let them laugh and little heeded them, for he was wise enough to know that nothing ever happened on this globe for good, at which some people did not have their fill of laughter in the outset, and knowing that such as these would be blind anyway, he thought it quite as well that they should wrinkle up their eyes and grins as have the malady in less attractive forms. His own heart laughed, and that was quite enough for him. He had no further intercourse with spirits, but lived upon the total abstinence principle. He's making a pun here. And he lived on the total abstinence principle ever afterwards. And it was always said of him that he knew how to keep Christmas well. If any man alive possessed the knowledge, may that be truly said of us and all of us. And so, as Tiny Tim observed, God bless us, everyone. The end. I said before that Dickens had two goals when he was writing A Christmas Carol. Well, one of the two ain't bad. The book was an immediate success. The first printing sold out by Christmas Eve, that is in 5 days. 2 more printings were sold out by the end of the year. 11 more printings were sold out by the end of 1844. But the book itself, with its color illustrations, which you've seen on the screen tonight, was expensive to produce and quickly pirated as they stole it against the copyright. And Dickens was disappointed by the relatively small profit he made from it. But that second goal, to rouse people's sympathies and inspire acts of compassion and generosity, that succeeded beyond Dickens' wildest imaginings. Dickens wrote other Christmas-themed stories, but none were as popular as A Christmas Carol. By 1850, Dickens was too busy writing David Copperfield to write a new tale. And in 1853, 10 years after its publication, Dickens gave a public reading of A Christmas Carol in Birmingham, which was so wildly successful that he continued to give dramatic readings, many to raise money for charity, in which he acted out all the parts, Dickens was a keen and apparently very good amateur actor. He acted all the parts and he added or changed material based on audience reactions. Well, who could do it but him? He's the author, right? And he continued to do this for the rest of his life. This is the posed photograph of what the setup is. It's not entirely unlike what I've got here, right? I mean, this is the modern version. I've got screens and everything. You can see he's got a jug of water and a glass, which I should have had when I accidentally choked on my own air in the middle of the reading. And that little stand there to rest his elbow on when he was holding the story, and a little pointer that could act out the part of all kinds of things, like the poker to beat crazy Scrooge off at the end. Mm-hmm. Charles Dickens died of a stroke at just the age of 58 in 1870, June 9th, to be specific. One epitaph printed at the time said he was a sympathizer with the poor, the suffering, and the oppressed, and by his death, one of England's greatest writers is lost to the world. A Christmas Carol has been examined and analyzed by historians, literature scholars, biographers, and theologians. It has become so classic a tale of redemption that all other stories that are like it have been compared to it. People will call it a Christmas Carol kind of story. And the character of Scrooge has come to represent the classic miser. Everyone knows what someone means when they say the name Scrooge. Or do we? There is, as they say, a lot to unpack here. And for the next 2 weeks, we are going to learn more about the character of Ebenezer Scrooge and the themes of compassion and redemption and what it means for us reading the story, which still manages to show us new things over 175 years after its publication. So stay tuned. Does anyone have any questions? Doing pretty well for time. Nothing wrong with ending a little bit sooner if we have to. Is there anyone online who wanted to ask anything? Doesn't look like it. No? Anyone here who had a question?
When you think of Scrooge, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Is it the redeemed Scrooge? Don't think so. No.
Archdeacon Sally's just pointing out that what is the first thing we think of Scrooge? Is it the redeemed Scrooge? And everyone agreed that that's not the first thing we think of when we think of Scrooge.
Yeah. How is that reinforced these days?
I guess. Archdeacon Sally's just saying that, oh, and I see Ed has raised his hand, and I'll get that. Archdeacon Sally has just said, yes, we have a very firm idea, and how's it being reinforced right now? Ed, I see your hand. Can you ask your question? Don't forget to unmute yourself.
Yeah. How differently did the people see this story when it was written than we do now?
That's a good question. I would say in many ways, not that differently. In that people found it, some people I think thought it was a little bit simple or a little bit maudlin, but on the whole, people loved it. The critics were very kind in the publication of it. And some people were genuinely inspired by reading it, both then and in the decades afterwards, to acts of charity. There was one chap who owned a factory, I think in the States, and he read the story and he was so moved by it that he gave all his workers Christmas off and bought them all a turkey, all of them. A lot of people were inspired to donate money to enact acts of charity. I would say one difference with us in this day and age is we've also seen, as we will explore even further in the final week of the study, lots of parodies and pastiches of the story. There's a certain joke about it. And I think too, as Archdeacon Sally was pointing out, we've come to it, we think of the miser Scrooge and not the redeemed Scrooge. Whereas I think if you ask people at the time, they'd think of Scrooge as a person who had enacted his journey and changed. Does that make sense?
Sure.
Good, good. We try to make sense. Any other thoughts or questions from online or here? Oh, I've got some questions here, Carl.
I'm just a little bit worried that the whole Christmas Carol and Scrooge and all of that is continuing to drown in a deepening pool of cynicism. Now, I'm going to call on my young friend Sally. Where are you to, Sally?
I'm hiding here.
Heaven knows I don't blame you. But
Repeat.
the song of Christmas by the piano playing comedian Tom Lehrer, you know.
Yes.
You can join in. I'm not going to sing it, but the Christmas time is here, by golly. Disapproval would be folly. Deck the halls with hunks of holly. Fill the cup and don't say when. Now, here we go. Kill the turkeys, ducks, and chickens. Deck the halls, drag out the dickens, even though the prospects sicken. Brother, here we go again. Did I get it right, Sally?
Oh, you're wonderful.
That's what I recall as well in the thing.
But isn't that something that we're all scared of with almost anything to do with Christmas? I don't want to use the word, open quote, commercial, and close quote, but is this, it doesn't make it any less wonderful to me and to probably all hands here and so on. But I suppose the whole thing about Christmas is it bothers me, not the festival, not the meaning and so forth, but all of the poor neo-Scrooges who are drowning in this pool of cynicism, but of contemporariness, if there is such a word. And as a result, it's Scrooge, same old. What's it got to do with us now, for heaven's sake?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, this is not me, but that's my
Yes. I guess yeah, how is the story still relevant? Am I summing that up kind of in a way, because we look at the story and we become cynical, oh, it's just another Christmas Carol? Is that a good way of saying it, Carl?
More or less, it's irrelevant. And you know what they say, irrelevant never forgets.
That's terrible, Carl. It's a terrible pun. Almost as bad as spirits and the total abstinence principle. I think it's interesting. I think there's always going to be grumps, right? There are always going to be Grinches at Christmas, and we'll talk about the Grinch, because the Grinch is kind of a Christmas Carol-like story in a way too. It's also about someone who's redeemed, right? There's always going to be people who don't care for it, and there's always going to be people too who will look at the story and think, that Tiny Tim is the most annoying child alive, and they would have been happy if he'd kicked the bucket, or they are cynical of Scrooge's redemption as well. But I think it's interesting. I chose to read some of the passages today. The God bless us, everyone. The things that people make fun of, right? And especially, I think Tiny Tim and a lot of Dickens' children get a bad rap, because Dickens had a contemporary and rival author named Anthony Trollope, who I actually like very much. And Anthony Trollope also, affectionately, teasingly called Dickens Mr. Popular Sentiment, and it's very sentimental. Dickens' writing, it's full of bizarre coincidences. This person is also this person is also this person, and then you run into them in the middle of London, the most populous city in the world, just by accident. And then you have these children that are many who are ill and yet somehow stay saintly. There's a lot of these things, and they've come to be regarded very cynically. But I think when you go back to the original, you see how deeply moving it is. And people don't know, like, how many of you have read the story, right? And you go back to it, you see like that beautiful passage, how is Tiny Tim at church, and he sits by himself a lot because he can't walk very well. He's got a crutch and sort of braces, what we call braces now, We don't actually know what was wrong with Tiny Tim medically. There are medical papers where people try to analyze, was it a form of tuberculosis? Was it rickets? Was it a lot of things, right? It's obviously something he could recover from if they had the money, whatever it is, right? But he spends a lot of time alone and he thinks deeply. This child, who we don't know how old he is, right? But he's probably quite young. This idea, I want everyone to see me at church, a cripple, to think about he who made the lame walk and the blind see, right? He's talking about Christ. He's this beautiful sort of innocent victim of poverty, and people sort of fell in love with this character at the time, and now I don't know, maybe it's bad child actors have soured people or what it is, but I think if people went back to the original, they would see the sincerity in it. I think there's something. I don't hate sentiment on principle. I think it's a good thing, especially at Christmas.
I think one of the interesting things too is that Dickens was not a particularly overtly religious person.
No.
But the message certainly hits at the heart of what we think. And it would be nice if, as we wander through this, if we could put words to what it is that the birth of this baby means to us. Oh, cute little baby, look at the shepherds, listen to the angels. But what does it mean?
Mm-hmm.
And what does the incarnation mean? Things like this. So the Rawls book, which we kind of got this idea, goes into that in great depth. That he's there's religiosity in Rawls' book that there is not so much in our approach, but I think that's one of the things that we want to think about as we go through this. I mean, you presented it beautifully. We now have this in front of us. What does it mean?
Mm-hmm.
Why does it touch?
And that's the thing, we start with the original, right? And then we can analyze. And so we're talking about what we'll be talking about in the next few weeks, and to be asked, as Archdeacon Sally was saying, to think more deeply and in depth about this story and about the Christmas story, that we get so used to it, right? And I, again, it's sentiment. It's a baby, far from home. There's no room at the inn. It's very sentimental and has been used so, but it's deeply, deeply meaningful and fundamental, right? We were all babies once, we were all that vulnerable and that small. It's quite remarkable. Anybody online wanted to ask anything else or make any other remarks? Not seeing anything. Did you? Yeah, Carmen.
I just wanted to offer a totally different view. Is that I find this program that I've been watching once a year, probably for 40 years, and I find it really hopeful. I don't think of Scrooge, this totally evil character. I'm more focused on the hopeful transition. And because he can change, I can change too.
Yeah. And that's exactly what Dickens was getting at. So is this the Alistair Sim version that you've been watching? Okay. Alistair Sim, right? The version. Top center. Top center is our beloved Alistair Sim, right? Beautiful, beautiful version of it. Classic. I think most of us at least seen 5 minutes of it on television, because they run it every year multiple times, and sometimes the colorized version, and then it's in Spanish, and that's great, right? And as Carmen was saying, right, for you, Carmen, it's a completely, we can be very cynical and think of Scrooge as a mean old miser, and I picked pictures of Scrooge before the transformation here. So we've got Patrick Stewart, Alistair Sim, Michael Caine, Walter Scott, Albert Finney, and of course Scrooge McDuck. These are all different, and of course there's many, many, many more, and these are all grumpy old, unrepentant Scrooge right at the beginning. And I picked them on purpose, but for you, Carmen, as you say, for you, it is very much about that transformation, and it's a joyful story, which is kind of the neat thing about, I mean, I think probably original readers would have been hoping that he would change, right? But they weren't quite sure how. It's there's a so I'm a big fan of detective novels, as many historians are apparently. And normally it's a whodunit, right? You're trying to find out who the murderer is or whatever, right? But there's a different kind that is sometimes called a how catch 'em. And Columbo is a really good example of this. You see the murder at the beginning, you know who did it and how they did it. And now the whole point of the mystery is to see how the detective catches them, right? When you've read or seen A Christmas Carol already and you know the ending of the story, you still want to watch to see how he gets there. It's the journey, right? And that's actually kind of the wonderful, we'll talk about this more in the fourth week when we talk about adaptations, but watching different actors portray that transformation is really fascinating. You know, this one, you know, you're like, well, he's already transformed in the first, you know, when Marley showed up, there's no, you know, he's done now, he's ready, right? And then others where they're very hard until the very end, right? And others where you see a gradual sort of transformation. It's a really interesting choice for an actor, you know?
I have a question.
Yes, Barbara. Hi.
Yeah. Hi. I'm a George C. Scott fan, so we watched that years and
I
years
said
and
Walter,
years.
didn't I? I said Walter
Um,
Scott. Sorry, George C. Scott, yes.
But we're talking about, you know, Scrooge and how he became generous. Da, 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 da. One of the underlying things that I always think is interesting is the nephew saying the only person who's hurt by this is Scrooge.
Mhm.
You know, that the damage that this has done to him because he doesn't enjoy and he doesn't, you know, it comes down to, well, what are you working for? You know, what are you doing?
And I think it's really interesting because I don't think Scrooge remembers. You know, he's got this goal in his head, but it's not a concrete one. He wants to be safe, I guess. You know, this idea in his head of you know, that if I make enough money, everything will be fine. But he doesn't spend it. He doesn't even spend it on himself, right? The you know, when the Ghost of Christmas Present talks about how huge the fire is in the living room, it's never been that big in that house. Scrooge, you know, Scrooge won't even let Bob Cratchit put another lump of coal on the fire to warm his hands so he can write, right? Because that's Cratchit's job, is to write things, and his hands are frozen, right? He's trying to warm them around a candle, you know. So it's I you know, and that's the whole point, right? Do you even remember anymore, Scrooge, what you wanted? And you know, when Belle breaks off their engagement, she says, I hope your money is able to comfort you, right? And it doesn't, as Fred knows, right? His money doesn't comfort him. His solitary nature doesn't comfort him. He's unhappy, and he's made himself so. And that's the tragedy of it. And that's why Fred is full of compassion for him, you know?
True, yeah, but he doesn't even realize that,
No,
though, right?
that's the whole point. He doesn't
There's
know.
no, yeah, there's,
Because
yeah,
he's so cold and so frozen. His heart is frozen. He's cut off from himself, right? Which
Yeah.
is something that can happen to any of us, isn't it?
yeah, oh,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Thank you, Barbara. Any other thoughts? Or we're getting near our time. If anybody has anything, any last things they want to say. But I'm very much, oh. Kathy.
It's not the Christmas Carol, but it's about how Charles Dickens wrote it.
Yeah, it's called The Man Who Invented Christmas. It came out.
I didn't like the title of it, Invented Christmas, but we have watched it, and they both about Charles Dickens character, and it's still quite good.
Yeah, it was 4 years ago.
I heard that the other day.
So Kathy's. No, it's quite new. Yeah. So Kathy is telling us about a movie that came out 4 years ago called The Man Who Invented Christmas. And it's more about Dickens' process in writing the story. But some of the characters appear to him, and especially Scrooge, who's played by the late, great Christopher Plummer. And it's about, you know, so the agony of trying to write something, especially when you're under a massive deadline like Dickens was. And Dickens, as I believe is portrayed in the movie, he's torn between his own family and providing for them and his parents, right? His relationship with his father. And, you know, you can fill pages and pages with an analysis of how Dickens felt about his father, John, right? Because he both worshiped him and wanted his approval, and yet he also despised him because of the fact that he had failed to provide for his family and put Dickens into this terrible situation at the age of 12. You know, and then just proceeded to be a complete disaster for the rest of his life. And Dickens was supporting him, which is not the way it's supposed to go in social, you know, constructs. You know, a man is supposed to provide for his family and not be a burden to his own children, right? And John Dickens sort of failed that compact as people understood it, right? So it was a difficult relationship.
I think it's on Netflix.
I think it
That
is.
must have been where we found it.
We think it's on Netflix or one of the streaming services, and I mean, obviously you could rent it. I bet the libraries have it.
CBC Gem.
Hmm?
CBC Gem. Gem.
Okay,
CBC online.
okay. Oh, right. Yeah, because it's an English British film, so that's streaming services there.
And saying Apple TV.
Apple TV. Yeah, Apple TV is a streaming service where you can get a lot of oh, I see Marianne, just a sec. Apple TV is where you can get a lot of British series and films. Excellent streaming service. Marianne, unmute yourself and ask.
I think I'm unmuted, am I?
You are, I can hear you just fine.
Okay, I just wanted to let you know because I was planning, my mom and I were planning to watch it after this. It is actually on Netflix, that one, The Man Who Invented Christmas.
Thank you, Marianne. Excellent. Marianne's on the case. Marianne knows. Thank you. Thank you. There you go. Yes. Any other last thoughts or? Okay, well, join us next week, same bat time, same bat channel. We will we'll be having it on Zoom, and then also it will be going up on YouTube afterwards. And you can join us in person or not. If, God forbid, any restrictions start to happen, we'll go solely to Zoom. Okay, hopefully not. Fingers crossed, or as our Bishop Shane Parker likes to say, Bishop Shane says, God willing and the people behaving. But you know, we'll still be able to do all of these things by Zoom if we have to, but if we don't, we will continue to have the in-person as well for anyone who wants to join us. Thank you so much. There's so many people here and so many people online. Thank you so much. Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm ending the meeting. Good night.